In the time video, I introduced two paradoxical brain twisters. The first was canceling logic by adding it to itself. And the second was the dual number that cancels by squaring. I probably should have led with the dual number since it's so easy to look up and see I'm not making this stuff up. A dual number provides a useful emptiness. It spreads value and helps define elementary logics, like this one. We won't go into the constructions in this video, but the fact we can square to 0 should warn you we can add to 0 too. The J operator first appeared with truth tables in the early 19th century. Boolean logic from the same era provides logical operators handling binary operations like truth. In this logic, OR combines separate things, increasing diversity in the set. It does not separate them. If I'm looking up cats or dogs, I will get articles on both in one diverse pile. I can't reverse this. And is reversible. If I ask for cats and dogs, everything I get has both and excludes what doesn't have both. This describes one perspective we can apply to Boolean logics. Let's examine the other. To invert perspectives, we change how the logic of not applies. I want coffee or juice in my cup. My cup is a 0 separating the two. When I choose one, I exclude the other. I am establishing a position by defining a point of exclusion, then picking one. I can reverse this. And, without the not, connects one option to the other. It includes both. An operator maps a procedure to transform elements from one context to another. Quaternions apply units of binary truth. When these are directional signs, they sort and assign direction. J is an operator of position. It establishes local focus first with a positive direction. Everything else is excluded by a minus sign, a negative. Position is one perspective at the exclusion of others. Let's say we have two perspectives. The first is not A, and the other is not B. Where they intersect, they cancel. Adding them creates a null intersection. To combine them, we have to shift perspectives. The one shifting perspective inverts. Negative inverts the perspective. It makes their sign agree, so they combine. I'd love to use a ball as an example, except we get distracted by the ball. We forget a key element of position is not position. A position is sustained by balancing at an absolute 0 probability. We commonly call this uncertainty. From this 0 point, we pivot one way or the other. To eliminate distraction, we will reduce the ball to a puzzle shape. Now we can see that the only way to combine these is to apply negative to flip one over. Adding up to nothing here doesn't cancel real value, it only cancels directional interaction. The negative flipping one over now makes them agree to combine into double the position. The concept of J is the very simple plus or minus one taught in middle school. Plus fills position and minus empties position. We assume we start from focus and empty thereafter. We can show this in the form of an acute triangle. The container side is the biggest side on the bottom. Value pours out to the field, curved into an arc. The field is anywhere but here. Value coming into position is flat. It curves onto the container, the surface of that container, then fills the volume. In the triangle, curvature determines perspective. The outgoing OR is curved. It is also irreversible and messy. Incoming or simplifies to position and can be reversed. The container spreading value is the scaling effect of time. This is B mode CMB. It is anisotropic, meaning it changes when you look at it from different angles. The value is either coming into focus or diverging out of focus. Sound familiar? It is already being observed in a distribution of positive and negative values. In particle physics, we can isolate some of this to form an elementary interactive logic by adding focus. The focus is typically matter exciting the field, called perturbation. Let's pretend we're creating such a focus. First, we need numbers we can manage so we can assign them to a grid. The more detailed the grid, the more accurate we are. Here, our terrain is relatively simple, and I assign arbitrary values for this example. We erase the pattern to see the numbers better and create a few focal choices. I purposefully overlap these because our selection is also arbitrary. Each circle could be treated as its own logic. Since we're dealing with the field, there is a probability it will come up one logic or another. We don't have any kind of certainty until we force focus by choosing. To problem solve, we need to assume an omniscient perspective and pick one. Then we cut off a loose end to keep this relatively simple. We now have a body of 16 numbers we can tabulate. These 16 numbers describe the area of time we know as the map. It is time because it is a spread of value. I know it sounds weird describing the map as time, but this also isn't a new practice, as you can see. I explained this in the physics of time video, the first video that has the light blue thumbnail background. So we won't go into it in detail here. Back to our sample. The values in this spread are real. There are several ways to add them up. First, let's find the total real value by adding up just the numbers, ignoring the signs. The real value is positive for local values of space and negative for general values. We don't care about those directions, so we add up their absolute values for a total sum of 34. The surface converts using c squared, so equivalence tells us our units are in joules. Lastly, we want to measure the depth. The surface is our flat observation, but the values spread into a volume, either coming into or going out of focus. For the depth of the focus, we will add up all the numbers accounting for their signs, their positives and their negatives. I wrote this at the top as the sum of jx, where x describes each value and j is its sign. Most of these sums cancel consistent with j plus j equals 0. What doesn't cancel is a difference in depth. Depth is also measured in time, but relative to the real values in it. In a sense, we're saying a cup of water has a depth relative to its content. This isn't a tidy cup, though. It is more like a puddle. Now we have a depth. If it were a tidy cup, then we can get away with the straight-up statistical J, because that's a 50-50 plus or minus. The negative tells us the value is overflowing out of focus. This container is emitting value. We now have a total energy within a volume and know the volume is emitting that value. The emission is known because we accounted for the changes in signs. If we expand the scope of this to include the entire CMB map, conservation would apply. Conservation says the universe of energy is closed. Energy is not created or destroyed, it can only transform. The proportions of positives and negatives will statistically cancel. NASA's Lambda CDM survey of dark matter and dark energy, which is contraction of space and unfolding of light through distribution, attempts to compute these. They do come close to expected proportions. 1 represents closed unit circle, and E, Euler's number, represents an open hyperbolic unit. The difference with the observation is simply what we can't observe. Mass is easy, so there's very little error there. Initially, I was using J like this to simplify simply substitute in for the plus or minus sign on a manual typewriter. Yes, my connecting these concepts predates personal computers and was entirely accidental. Because it squares to -1 and has other features of a complex operator, we can't simply slip it in any way we want. It has to apply as a function, simplifying. Applying j to a radical is an extraordinary claim which requires us to show, well, extraordinary cause. When we factor out a negative, we have to use the right operator. J applies to a real position or path axis, like x. If the function is tidy like this with a negative, you can pull out that negative, then j is present. If it is a qualitative axis that distributes value like y, then I is the operator of choice. It is also not tidy like this. If it is a complex axis like a radius or z-axis, it will also be untidy, and in which case the h operator applies. The h operator is the square root of I times j. Anyway, we will apply these together shortly. Here, we started with j outside the radical and factored it back in. A radical already comes with a built-in plus or minus feature that follows computing the radical. We must leave it alone until the end. One way to look at it is to note that j applies on multiple levels. In this case, we factored the local level back into the radical before we started, and the general was left out. Once we solve the radical, we're in the general perspective, so we can now apply that j. Consider the same function, but without an initial j to factor in. Now only the general j applies, so you aren't risking confusing local with general logics. You can factor it in without consequences so long as you don't forget and assert it twice. This algebraic application shows us how to establish a complex position using a circle. A circle is basically a two-dimensional position. It's a complex point. If this was just x plus iy, we would have Euler's helix. A helix squared is a messy quadratic function. To close the helix and simplify it into a circle, we apply j. J also makes the resulting axis a complex radius requiring h be applied to r. H is the root again of the root of I times j. These are all members of the quaternion family, so each squares to -1. The j plus j equals 0 feature here keeps this operation tidy. It doesn't become quadratic. The negatives describe our perspective drawing the circle as an extension of r from the intersection of x and y. Once established, we simplify to a general perspective onto the perimeter rather than out to it. This flips the sign to positive. Which sign applies depends on our perspective. The perimeter now becomes a point defining a complex reference, a color code to keep track of things. Operators squaring to negative have a bad habit of disappearing into generalizations. When we flip perspectives, we lose those references due to uncertainty principle. Uncertainty principle is a compelling reason that j plus j equals 0, and we can see this practically with gravity. In 3 dimensions, a circle is a sphere. It does add yet another operator, but we don't want to completely confuse you. So let's keep it simple. J is the operator establishing focus. I extends that focus to the perimeter. On a sphere, the perimeter is the surface, and the effect of focus is gravity enfolding into that position. Position is established by mixing the useful emptiness with its content. The container is generically rounded by this, and excess rounding projects as rotation, giving a centrifugal effect. This widens the equator as a function of terrain. It doesn't change anything else. This centrifugal field is handy for gravitational slingshots. You fall in, then change direction. You basically miss the ground, so to speak. The change in direction is critical to negate the fall and embrace a hyperbolic boost. Notice that this resolves the Ehrenfest paradox of relativity trying to make sense of a moving and rotating cylinder. Earth isn't a cylinder, but as a sphere, we see widening of the equator, but no change in the gravity. And when we go into orbit, we encounter microgravity in the null region between. In this realm of microgravity, the gravity contracting cancels with the exclusion of the field. One J added to another has no effect. It doesn't cancel the real value. It just means there's no direction to go in. As we saw with sampling CMB, there's an anomaly here where gravity encounters the field. NASA used connected satellites to follow this pattern and measure the anomaly of gravity. The project was called GRACE. As you see, the anomaly of gravity does not follow the expected terrain. It follows the energy density like hotspots. You don't have to take this ride to see it yourself. The anomaly causes a small difference in your experience of time, which can be monitored with a smartphone app. There's typically more than one way to arrive at a solution. Operators like J give us a way to express a concept like this. J couldn't do this and add up to anything but 0. Thanks for watching. Be sure to upvote and follow for more.